spoke about consciousness, that it's the hard problem in science.
Yes.
And so what is your understanding of consciousness? First part of the question, and the second part, spirituality. What is your understanding of spirituality in connection with science? Should there be a connection, and should science and should spirituality be introduced into science?
Well, these are two huge questions. Well, I'll start with consciousness. Well, as you know, consciousness was more or less ignored by scientists until about 20 years ago. It was simply regarded as a philosophical problem of no scientific interest. And amazingly, for much of the 20th century, in the United States and in Britain, the mainstream of psychology, behaviorism, was a form of psychology that denied the existence of subjective experience. It said that the only scientific kind of psychology there could be was a psychology that measured movements and glandular secretions, that consciousness had no place in psychology. So I think that the main function of consciousness is the coexistence of possibilities and choosing among them. Most of our mental life is unconscious because it's habitual. Our habits are typically unconscious. So a great deal of our mental activity is not conscious. It is mental, but it's unconscious. And this is, of course, something that Freud and Jung highlighted in their work, and which everybody, I think, now agrees that a large part of our mind is unconscious. Now, when we come to the connection between this study of consciousness from a philosophical and a scientific point of view and spirituality, I think that what the spirituality is concerned with is the links between our more limited kind of consciousness and other forms of consciousness in the universe. The possibility that there are many other forms of consciousness in the universe, that there may be the whole planet, Earth, might have a kind of mind, the whole solar system, the entire universe, and there may be a kind of consciousness that includes the entire universe but transcends it. Now that would normally be called God, or the Supreme Being, or Brahma in the Hindu tradition. And so I think the point of spirituality, which is at the heart of all religions, of all religious traditions, is the direct experience of the connection of our minds with a larger form of consciousness.
Do you think that it's possible to get to any scientific results without having a spiritual experience? Also, to gain material knowledge should be some prerequisite capacity of having spiritual knowledge, isn't it? What do you think?
Well, as a historical fact, the majority of scientists, I think, haven't used spiritual experience as part of their science, and many scientists today are atheists and are actively hostile to any kind of spiritual practice. So it's not the case that most scientists today are going into deep meditative states before making their discoveries. Most of them are treating science as a job. You arrive at the laboratory, you do your work, you publish it in journals, and if you publish enough, you get promotion and more grants. It's a career. And for most of them, at least in public, it doesn't have anything to do with spirituality. In private, of course, quite a few scientists are religious or have spiritual interests, but they don't usually talk about it at work.
No, but the outcome of the research is then appropriate to this materialistic approach, isn't it?
Well, it's a materialistic, science is based on a materialist philosophy at the moment. The whole point of my book is to question that materialist philosophy and show that it's very bad for science. It's not the scientific philosophy, it's a scientific philosophy that's actually very limiting for science. And I don't think science has to be based on materialism, but as a matter of historical fact, it is at the moment. Its results are materialistic, its effects are materialistic for the most part, and they bring advantages and disadvantages that come from that general approach. Yes.
And you mentioned this Trinitarian or Trinity
Yes.
approach. What do you mean with this?
I lived in India for a long time, and there's a kind of trinity of gods there. There's Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, the creator, the destroyer, and the preserver.
Yes.
There's, within the ultimate state of consciousness, as described in some Hindu texts as Satchitananda, being knowledge, bliss. In the Tantra tradition, in Hinduism and Buddhism, you have the Shiva and Shakti, but joined together in a unity. In Taoism, you have yin and yang in the circle, which is the third principle that contains the two. And in the Christian version of the Trinity, the central image of God in Christianity is as the Holy Trinity. I'm a Christian, and so for me the Trinitarian model that I think about most is the Christian version of it. And there we have the Father, Logos, and Spirit. The Father, Son, and Spirit is in St. Augustine's model of the Holy Trinity, is the knower, the known, and the joy of knowledge, which is very similar to Kashmiri Shaivism, where there's a trinity of knower, known, and the means of knowledge.
Which is also mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, the same principle.
Yes, yes. So we find very similar principles among people who've thought deeply about these questions. And that's why I think that a Trinitarian model is the best starting point. Of course, there can be 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., but a minimum. The Trinity seems to be the minimum. If we go to a duality, it's deeply unsatisfactory, because why should these two things be related at all? They can only really hold together if they're enclosed by a third or part of another principle. And of course this comes up in so many contexts. In Hegel it comes up in the form of the dialectic, the synthesis, which includes the thesis and the antithesis, which is again the third principle, is the inclusive unifying principle that includes the polarity of the others.
So we have a question from Gabriele Sick also, she likes to ask.
This is actually a good point for my question, because now we got actually into a deep spiritual discussion, and we are far away from the regular methods of science, like the positivistic methods. I want to see something making it clear. So what do you think? How, or is there a way of other methods in science? Like all this measuring and stuff, because I don't think, or this is the question, if we want to go more deeply into spirituality, we have to find other methods.
Well, I think that we can study a lot of things using standard scientific methods. With psychic phenomena like telepathy, we can use standard techniques. I use them all the time. If we're interested in, is a dog telepathic about its owner coming home, we film the dog, we find out when it starts waiting, we can have the owner come at random times to rule out the possibility it's just coincidence, and so on. So we can extend the scientific method much further than it's been extended so far. But if we're dealing with the phenomena of subjectivity, of direct inner experience, then obviously we can only study it through subjective reports, people's reports of their unconscious states. But that can also be looked at in a somewhat scientific way. Alistair Hardy's study of mystical experience, for example, he collected thousands of reports from people about their mystical experiences, and he then approached it like a naturalist, the natural history. Do these fit into categories? And he found, yes, they do. Some people's had nature mysticism. They're outdoors, they're looking at a sunset, or they're on a mountain. They have this tremendous feeling of unity with the earth, and the beauty of the earth, and the sense of purpose and divine presence in nature. That's one kind. Then there's another kind which would be unitive experience where all distinctions disappear. That would mostly be meditating with their eyes closed. So there's a variety of kinds of mystical experience, and looking at those scientifically, they can fall into categories. William James, the great American psychologist, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, also did a kind of study of the natural history of religious experience. So that we could call scientific. And I suppose that we can. It's also an empirical question as to if they do meditative practices, does everyone have similar experiences? How long does it take them to have these experiences? We can compare meditation methods. We can find out which are more effective, and all of those are empirical inquiries. But we can't, through science, I think, arrive at an ultimate understanding of the nature of God or the divine being, because that's something we can only arrive at through direct experience. And we can have theories of God. All religions have theories of God, like the Holy Trinity is a theory of God, and Kashmiri Shaivism has a theory of God. I mean, I think there's certain areas where empirical science has to sort of fade out and direct experience come in, but exactly where you draw the borderline depends on what you define as science. And in Germany there's a broader definition of science than there is in England. And by science in England we just mean natural science, whereas Wissenschaft in Germany is a much wider word. It's a much broader concept.
I have a final last question,
yes.
Because this is going out on the internet, and mainly it's people that would like to support the work you do. My last question would be, what could we do as a media or as students or as people who believe in all the things that you do? What can we do? How can we support you?
Well, I think the main thing is to come out. This is something everyone can do, is to talk about these kinds of questions to people at work. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're all used to talking about these things to our friends or family members, but the ethos of most universities and most science departments is this kind of public materialism. Most people, or at least a large minority, are not really materialists, but they pretend to be when they're at work because they expect everyone else will pretend to be. And so, just like in the gay liberation movement, people just talking, if they've had psychic experiences or spiritual experiences, to talk about them to people. And if people say, well, that's ridiculous, but then say, well, why is it ridiculous? And have you ever had experiences like this yourself? And after the first resistance breaks down, I think people would share with each other in a much more interesting way. And this would help to break the taboo. What we do need to do is break down these powerful taboos, and it takes a certain amount of personal courage to do that.